I still remember the morning when my entire world changed forever. I was sitting beside the crib of my newborn twins when the man I loved walked into our apartment with a look I had never seen before. I smiled because I believed he had come home ready to begin our new life. Instead, he looked at me and said, "We need to talk. My name is Claire Bennett, and only a few weeks earlier I had believed love could survive anything. I met Ethan Montgomery on a quiet autumn afternoon in New York. I was a young interior designer searching for opportunities after college. Ethan seemed ordinary when we first met at a small neighborhood cafe. He had bright blue eyes, a gentle smile, and a calm personality. The Montgomery family controlled a massive real estate empire. Ethan never behaved like a spoiled heir. We fell in love quickly, and I believed I had found the man I would spend my life with. When I became pregnant, Ethan was happier than I had ever seen him. He promised to protect me and our children. Then I met his mother, Evelyn Montgomery. She lived in a mansion filled with expensive paintings and crystal chandeliers. Evelyn looked at me with cold gray eyes. She already knew about my pregnancy. After that evening, everything began to change. Ethan started receiving frequent calls from his mother. He became quiet, distant, and restless. Whenever I asked what was wrong, he told me not to worry. Then our twins were born. For a short moment, I thought our children would bring us closer again. Ethan held them in his arms and smiled, but something inside him had already broken. One morning, he came home while I was rocking our babies. I looked at him and smiled. He could not return the smile. He stood near the door before speaking. "I cannot do this anymore," he whispered. My heart immediately began to race. I asked him what he meant. He looked away and said his mother was right. He said we did not belong in the same world. Then he told me he had to leave. I could barely breathe. I asked if he was leaving me and his own children. He said nothing. He turned around and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he whispered that he was sorry. Then the door closed. I stood there holding back tears while my newborn children slept peacefully. That was the moment I understood that I was alone, but I also understood something else. My children still had me. No matter how broken I felt, I would not abandon them. I wiped my tears and promised myself that I would find a way forward. I did not know it yet, but that terrible morning would become the beginning of the strongest chapter of my life. I looked at my babies and felt strength rising inside me. I was frightened, but I knew I had to keep moving forward. The first days after Ethan left were the darkest days I had ever known. My body was still recovering from childbirth while my heart felt shattered. Every morning I woke beside two tiny babies and remembered that their father had walked away. I cried when they cried. Sometimes I stared at the ceiling, wondering how my life had changed so quickly. Only weeks earlier, I had imagined Ethan beside me as we raised our children together. Now I had to become their mother and father. Friends called constantly, but I rarely answered. I worried about money because I had stopped working before the twins were born. My old interior design position was no longer available. I began sending applications everywhere. Most companies rejected me after learning that I had newborn twins. Some employers explained that they needed someone who could work late evenings and weekends. Each rejection made me feel smaller. Still, every time I looked at my children, I found another reason to continue. I learned to manage everything alone. I changed diapers. I prepared bottles while searching for freelance opportunities. At night when the twins slept, I opened my laptop and worked until exhaustion forced my eyes closed. Eventually, I found a small freelance interior design position. The money was modest, but it allowed me to pay rent. For the first time since Ethan left, I felt a small spark of hope, but I knew freelance work would not provide the security my children needed. I needed something that belonged completely to me. One afternoon, while folding baby clothes, I noticed how expensive beautiful children's clothing had become. Affordable clothes often looked plain while attractive designs cost far more than parents could comfortably spend. An idea suddenly entered my mind. What if I created clothing myself? My mother had taught me basic sewing when I was young. I borrowed an old sewing machine from a neighbor and began experimenting. My first creations were simple. I made soft onesies, little leggings, and small dresses for my twins. When I photographed them and posted the pictures online, several mothers asked where they could buy them. That question changed everything. I realized I had discovered an opportunity. I had almost no savings, but I refused to let that stop me. Every dollar I earned from freelance work was divided between household expenses and fabric. I taught myself sewing techniques and practiced late into the night. My apartment became a tiny workshop. Fabric covered one table, while thread and patterns filled another. The twins slept nearby as I worked. I was exhausted, but I felt alive. For the first time since Ethan abandoned us, I was not simply surviving, I was building something. I did not know whether my idea would succeed, but I knew one thing: I would give it everything I had. I would build a future where my children would never wonder whether they were wanted. Just the first orders arrived, and each one felt like a victory. My first customer was a young mother from Chicago who purchased a newborn outfit for her baby girl. When the payment notification appeared, I cried because someone believed in my creation. Soon mothers sent messages praising the soft, comfortable clothing. Some sent photographs of their babies wearing my designs. Those pictures filled my heart with joy. I decided to name my brand Little Blessings because my children had become the reason I refused to surrender. Every day became a race. I cared for the twins during the morning. I worked on designs during their naps. At night, I packed orders and answered messages. My apartment looked more like a workshop than a home. I did not complain. For the first time, I saw a future. I improved my photography and created a simple website. I wrote about my experience as a single mother, building a business. I shared my struggles. Slowly, people began connecting with my story. One evening, everything changed. A popular mother and baby influencer discovered one of my posts. She shared my clothing with her followers and praised the quality. Within hours, my phone exploded. Messages arrived constantly. Orders multiplied faster than I could process them. I stared at the screen. The woman who once worried about diapers was now struggling with orders. I called a friend for help. Together, we spent an entire night preparing packages. The next morning, I realized Little Blessings was becoming bigger. I rented a small workshop and hired 2 people to help with production. My designs appeared in parenting communities across the country. 6 months after making my first outfit, my life looked completely different. I was no longer working only to survive. I was building a real company. One evening, I received an email from a retailer in New York. They wanted to discuss bringing Little Blessings into their stores. My hands trembled as I read the message. I looked toward the twins sleeping peacefully. They had no idea. They only knew that their mother was there. I smiled through tears because I finally understood something important. Ethan had walked away believing he was choosing security. He had chosen money and family expectations over us. His decision forced me to discover a strength I never knew I possessed. I did not need his inheritance. I did not need his family name. I needed courage, patience, and willingness to keep moving. The meeting became the beginning of an entirely new chapter. Little Blessings was about to leave my small apartment and enter stores across America. For the first time, I believed my best chapter had not yet begun. That night, I sat beside my sleeping children and whispered a promise. No matter what happened next, I would never stop fighting for the life they deserved. I had started with 2 babies and a broken heart. Now I finally had hope, and hope was enough to keep me moving forward. The meeting with the New York retailer changed everything. I arrived carrying samples from Little Blessings and a notebook filled with designs. I tried to remain calm, but my hands were shaking. The executives examined every outfit carefully. They asked about production costs, delivery schedules, and future designs. I answered questions honestly. When they offered me a partnership, I could not believe what I was hearing. Little Blessings would soon appear in stores across New York. I returned home with tears in my eyes. My children were playing when I entered. I picked them up and held them close. They were too young to understand. They smiled anyway. That evening, I called my closest friend and told her the news. She reminded me how far I had come. I remembered the tiny apartment, the borrowed sewing machine, the rejected applications, the nights when I wondered whether I could afford another week. Now everything was changing. Orders increased every month. I hired more workers and moved production into a larger workshop. I also learned that success brought new responsibilities. Customers expected quality. Retailers expected reliability. Employees depended on me. I could no longer treat Little Blessings like a small experiment. It had become a real company. I learned business management. I studied marketing. I negotiated contracts. Challenges frightened me at first. Then I remembered the morning Ethan left. If I had survived that moment, I could survive anything. Years passed quickly. My twins grew from babies into cheerful little children. They became familiar with the workshop. They loved seeing new fabrics arrive. Sometimes they helped choose colors for future designs. Their laughter filled the office. I often looked at them and felt grateful. Without realizing it, they had pushed me toward a life I never imagined. Little Blessings eventually opened its first flagship store in New York. Customers lined up during the opening weekend. Local magazines began writing about my journey. Then a national business publication requested an interview. The reporter asked what inspired me to start the company. I looked at my children before answering. I told her that I started because I needed to survive, but I continued because I wanted my children to know that difficult beginnings do not determine the ending. The article spread quickly. Soon people across the country knew my story. Some praised me, others asked how I managed everything alone. I never described myself as extraordinary. I simply believed that giving up was not an option. Then one afternoon, I received a message that brought my past back into my life. The sender was someone I had not heard from in years. It was Ethan. His message contained only a few words. "Amanda, can we meet?" I stared at the screen for a long time. I had spent years building a life without him. Now suddenly the man who had walked away wanted to return. I did not know why, but I knew that whatever happened next would test the woman I had become. I stared at Ethan's message for several minutes before deciding whether to answer. For years I had imagined what I would say if he returned. Sometimes I imagined anger, sometimes I imagined tears, but when the moment arrived I felt almost nothing. I eventually replied that we could meet. We chose a quiet park where my children often played. When I arrived, Ethan was already waiting. He looked older than I remembered. The confident man who had walked away was gone. His shoulders seemed heavier and his face carried exhaustion. "He stood when he saw me, Amanda," he said quietly. I nodded. He looked toward the children playing nearby. I could see emotion in his eyes. I asked why he wanted to meet. He took a slow breath. "I saw your story in the newspapers," he said. "I saw what you built." Then he admitted something I already understood. He had made the wrong choice. His mother had convinced him that love could be sacrificed for wealth and family reputation. He believed leaving us would secure his future. Instead, he had gained money and lost the people who truly loved him. I listened without interrupting. Then he apologized. He said he did not expect forgiveness. He wanted me to know that he regretted abandoning us. I looked at him calmly. Years earlier, I would have begged him to stay. Now I was standing there as a successful woman with two wonderful children. I told him that his apology did not change my life. I had already rebuilt everything without him. He lowered his head. I could see that my words hurt, but they were not meant to punish him. They were simply the truth. I told him that he had chosen his path and I had chosen mine. Then I stood and walked toward my children. For the first time, I realized that I did not need revenge. My success was enough. My happiness was enough. My children were enough. Ethan remained on the bench watching us leave. I never looked back. Later that evening, I found another message waiting. It was from Evelyn. She wanted to speak with me. I almost deleted it. Then I wondered why the woman who pushed Ethan away would contact me now. I agreed to meet her. The next afternoon, I entered a private restaurant. Evelyn was sitting alone at a table. She looked composed as always, but there was something different in her expression. She no longer looked powerful, she looked tired. She told me Ethan had changed after seeing me again. He had begun questioning everything she taught him. For years, she believed she was protecting the Montgomery legacy. Now she realized she had destroyed her son's happiness. I listened quietly, then she surprised me. She apologized. It could not erase the past, but I saw regret in her eyes. I thanked her. Then I stood up. I had nothing left to prove to anyone anymore. Now my life was finally mine. The weeks after my meeting with Evelyn passed quietly. I returned to my work and refused to let the past interrupt the future I had built. Little Blessings continued growing, and soon we opened another flagship store in Los Angeles. My children were older now and understood that their mother had created the company they loved. They often visited the stores and proudly told people that the clothes were designed by their mother. Every time I heard that, I smiled. I had once feared that my children would grow up believing their father had abandoned them because they were not enough. I wanted them to understand that another person's decision never determines their worth. Then I learned something unexpected about Ethan. He had confronted Evelyn and told her he could no longer live according to her expectations. He had walked away from the Montgomery estate. He gave up the inheritance he had once feared losing. He left behind the luxury cars, the mansion, and the powerful position waiting for him. For the first time, he wanted to discover who he was without his family name. When I heard this, I felt no excitement and no satisfaction. I simply hoped he would find peace. Months later, I received a letter from him. He explained that leaving the estate had been difficult. He was working on a small business of his own and living in a modest apartment. He did not ask for another chance. Instead, he thanked me. He said that seeing my strength had forced him to recognize his weakness. He admitted that he had spent years blaming circumstances when the truth was that he had been afraid to make his own choices. I read the letter twice, then I placed it inside a drawer. I did not need to answer. My silence was not hatred, it was acceptance. I had finally accepted that some people belong in our memories but not in our future. One evening, my children and I sat together in the living future. My daughter asked me why their father was not part of our family. I carefully explained that sometimes adults make choices they later regret. She asked whether I was angry with him. I looked at my children and smiled. I told her that I had been angry once, but anger could not build a future. Love for them could. That night after they went to sleep, I stood beside the window. The city lights stretched across the distance. I remembered the tiny apartment where I had once cried beside two newborn babies. I remembered believing that my life was over. Now I understood that it had only been beginning. I had lost a relationship, but I had found courage. I had lost security, but I had built independence. I had lost the future I imagined, but I created one that was better, and I knew the final chapter was still waiting to be written for myself and for the children I loved most. Years later, I finally understood that the morning Ethan left had not destroyed my life. It had changed the direction of my life. Little Blessings had become a successful national brand, and my children had grown into loving young people. Our home was filled with laughter. I no longer woke wondering how I would pay the next bill. I no longer measured my worth through another person's approval. Sometimes strength is simply getting out of bed when your heart is broken. Sometimes it is working through exhaustion because someone depends on you. Sometimes it is choosing hope when giving up feels easier. I thought about Ethan occasionally as the years passed, but not with anger, not with longing. He had made his choices. I had made mine. Evelyn eventually stepped away from controlling every part of her son's life. We never became a family again, and I accepted that truth completely. My children knew their story, they knew they were loved, they knew their father had made mistakes, but those mistakes were never their fault. One evening, we gathered around the dinner table. My son looked at me and said, "Mom, I am proud of you." I told them everything I built was not because I was fearless. It was because I was afraid and continued anyway. That was the lesson I wanted them to remember. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is moving forward while fear is still beside you. I remembered the young woman sitting alone beside two newborn babies. She believed her future had ended. She was wrong. Her future had only begun. I had lost love, but found myself. I had lost security, but built independence. I had lost a family I thought I needed, but created a family filled with genuine love. Most importantly, I learned that nobody else gets to decide the value of your life. If someone walks away from you, that does not mean you are worthless. If someone rejects you, that does not mean you cannot rise. Sometimes the greatest beginning comes after the hardest goodbye. I looked toward my children and smiled. My story was never really about Ethan or Evelyn. It was about a woman who refused to remain broken. It was about a mother who turned pain into purpose. And it was about two children who gave her a reason to keep going. I closed the curtains that night with a peaceful heart and thanked life for giving me another chance. There was no revenge and there was no desire to punish anyone. There was no bitterness. There was only gratitude for the life I had built. If this story touched your heart, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us what you would have done in my situation after hearing this story in my place. Thank you for watching, and remember, your hardest chapter does not have to be your final chapter.